Hello, welcome back to these little video reflections. This is the second part on the reflections from the World of Tomorrow conference in Islamabad in Pakistan. I am no longer in Pakistan. I am now back in my house in Korea, but want to kind of still cover a few of the themes and ideas that happened in the conference. So in this reflection, I want to talk a little bit about some of the themes and ideas that were kind of focused on in the panel that I was on, Art Without Boundaries, and talk a little bit more in depth on those themes. So to start off, one of the things that I noticed that come up a lot when people talk about the future of arts is this kind of idea that the arts are dying, that people, especially kids, don't want to study arts anymore, that there's not enough students, there's not enough interest, everybody just wants to play on their phones, and that's kind of the way the future is going to be. But it completely discounts the understanding that art speaks to its own time, that art comes from its own context. And from my perspective, looking around, I see actually more creativity than ever in the world today in terms of how much easier it is to do your own work, to have your own platform, to make videos on YouTube, to use photo editors. You know, there's so much more accessibility in terms of the arts, and actually people are able to express their creativity more easily than it was in the past. And there's this funny idea like creativity can go away, you know, that somehow humans are going to stop being creative when we've been creative for as long as our existence. I think that the reason people say this is because there's a perception that art's professionalism is diminishing, in the sense that there are many more people doing arts but amateurly, and that the professionalism of the arts is diminishing, and that when you look at the professional field, you see, or so they say, less students are becoming arts professionals and more students are being interested in studying business and computer coding. However, this doesn't really account for the fact that arts professionals have never been particularly mainstream, right? They've never been at the center of consciousness, and there's never been many of them at any one time, right? So you don't see lots of arts professionals walking around. It's an unusual job. It always has been, and it continues to be. However, now you have a much greater visibility of amateurs. So you see many amateur dancers, musicians, photographers posting their work on the internet. So you kind of have a greater vision of the amateur, and then you wonder where the professionals have gone. But I think the arts professionals have not diminished or grown. There's always going to be less of them than other professions in society, and so what we just have now is just greater visibility for the amateurs, which is great because people can get involved. I think one of the toughest things about the arts field is that we tend to confuse arts professionals with arts. And especially in schools, for example, we talk about how kids should learn science, should learn math, should learn literature. But you're only going to learn arts if you're going to become an artist. And that's why these arts programs are cut, because it's just like, well, they're useless, Not many people are going to become artists, and so therefore we should cut these programs. But they don't account for how vital creativity is in all professions. And creativity, innovation they call it these days, it's the buzzword. Everybody is looking for innovation and creativity, and this is what the arts trains you. And so there's this kind of confusion that if you're going to learn the arts, you have to be an artist, but not that you just have to learn arts because it's good for your career. And I think that this is why you kind of see people are fearing that arts professionalism is something of the past. Profession is a mindset, it's a mentality, and it cannot change one way or another. There are people who are professional artists, but then there is also art, and I think it's important that we don't confuse the two. Another theme that we talked a lot in our panel is the theme of globalization. And it's often seen as also a threat to the future of arts because it tends to make a global standard. And in this case, I think this is a legitimate concern in the sense that when you do have something global, it tends to become standardized, and all too often I feel like standardization actually means westernization, and that the global standard ends up being what the West has decided is the standard, and everybody has to conform. There's a wonderful book, it's called The Radican by Nicholas Borio. He's an art critic, and he talks about postmodern art and how multiculturalism in art is actually Western art, because he pointed out, you will judge, for example, a European or an American artist simply for the work itself, but there's this sort of sense that you must judge, for example, a Cambodian artist, a Korean artist, from the context that they come from. It's like you include them in the conversation, but just because of their context, and not simply putting them side by side. It's like, oh, you can't do that because that wouldn't be fair, whereas it's actually creating a bias. And I think that that's something we have to deal with as a global society. For example, in contemporary dance, you notice that most of it seems very similar. Contemporary dance from different countries tends to sort of follow a certain mold, and I think it's very important that we find ways of including diversity. And one of the things that, one of the concepts that Borio talks about in this book, Radican, is the process of translation. So it's not the idea that everything becomes a single language, but that you take something from this language and translate into this language. And so you have a culture that is translated into this culture. And so it's a different concept than the idea of unification and standardization as simply translation across the world. And I think that's something that we really need to keep in mind going forward, especially as everything is kind of melding and disappearing into kind of this one global standard. These are kind of the two main themes of the panel, was globalization and the future of the arts. Like, are the arts going to be okay? I think it's just important to remember in all of this that creativity isn't going anywhere. The arts aren't going anywhere. The arts arise from the context in which they're in, and that's why they seem scary, because we don't really understand the context that we're in. I'll give you an example. When ballet started, it was just a social dance in the French courts. These days we kind of have it in our minds as this big traditional unchanging art form, but really it started about 500 years ago in the French courts, and as it grew and developed and more steps were added, when women started to dance on point, it was highly controversial. When tutus started creeping up the legs, highly controversial. In 1913, when the Rite of Spring was performed in Paris for the first time by the Ballet Russe, it caused a riot. Literally, it caused a riot in the theater. People were throwing stuff, it was so loud the dancers couldn't hear the music, and Nijinsky, the choreographer, was standing in the wings shouting at the dancers, the count, so they could keep going. It's crazy, right? Like, can you imagine starting a riot in the opera today? But what it kind of shows us is that, the future, the now, where it's going, is always confusing and uncertain because we don't have the retrospective to put it in context. Someone asked me during the panel, why is it called contemporary dance? Why? Because it's contemporary, but how do we distinguish it from what came before? I don't think we can right now because we don't have the perspective. We don't have the retrospective. We can look back now at that performance at the Ballet Russe in Paris and say, that was the beginning of modern dance. But try telling that to somebody at the time. They were outraged. And I think that a lot of what's going on in the world today with the art that's being created and the way the millennials are working is similar to this. People are outraged because they don't understand the context yet. And the context can only be understood with time. So what do? Create. Keep creating. I have one more video reflection to do after this. It's going to cover topics about sustainability and individual responsibility. So if you want to check that out, stay tuned.